Nations independent expert on protection from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Of presenting my preliminary observations on my visit to Ukraine, which has been carried out from 30 April to 10 May of this year. The mandate of the independent expert was created by the United Nations Human Rights Council with the purpose of examining how violence and discrimination manifest themselves in the everyday life of millions of lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans persons around the world. It is built on the notion that sexual orientation and gender identity is a trait that every person on earth possesses. And yet these most human of human traits, in some cases, when it varies from what is seen to be the norm in a particular context, lies at the base of much violence and discrimination around the world. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations first explored this issue through reports in 2011 and 2015, when it determined that the levels of aggression to persons belonging to sexual diversity reached levels that were absolutely unconscionable. Around the world, people are subject to killings, beatings, torture, and systematic exclusion from social life. The mandate of the independent expert was created with the purpose of understanding how these realities operate on everyday life and advising states on the measures that can be adopted to ensure that violence and discrimination are eradicated. My visit to Ukraine was carried out upon invitation from the government, and I am grateful to the state of Ukraine for its invitation and the excellent collaboration that I've had in the course of this visit. I'm also grateful to the many organizations of civil society that have taken the time to speak to me, and to all state and non-state actors. I want to assure you my gratitude because of your collaboration. These preliminary observations will be followed by a report that will be issued by my mandate and that will be presented to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in June of 2020. I started by mentioning that sexual orientation and gender identity lie at the base of much violence and discrimination around the world. This is because they are associated, in some cases, with deep stigma. This is not an exception in Ukraine. After these days in Ukraine and after the many conversations that I've held, I am in the position to conclude that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans persons in Ukraine are not truly free and equal. Stigma that is associated with their very identity forces them into secrecy. Fearful of violence in case that they reveal their true identities, they are forced to keep them hidden. This factor is also associated with the fact that there is a significant challenge in obtaining information about the very existence of LGTB persons in Ukraine. Yet these are real people that we encounter every day in our lives. Gay and lesbian, trans and bisexual people will be our sons and daughters, will be our parents, they're our neighbors. They are also our doctors and our lawyers and the people who sell things to us in the market. They are everywhere. But we don't really see their identities if they are compelled to keep them hidden. I'll give you a few examples of how this manifests itself. When analyzing social integration, one thinks of certain aspects of life. People go to school in a certain place. Yet we know very little about the realities of bullying against LGBT people in Ukrainian schools. Some civil society organizations have produced studies that say that 4 out of every 5 students that identify as LGBT have been bullied. Those same studies will tell you that 1 out of 2, 50% of those persons, report having been subject to some sort of physical violence. The same thing can be said of the domain of employment. I heard many stories of persons who have been fired when they revealed their sexual orientation. They revealed that they were lesbian, or they were revealing that they were gay. Or when this identity was found or suspected by third persons. Yet, there is a significant challenge in the fact that the state doesn't actually have any knowledge of the problematic. Very little data or studies are obtained in relation to the situation in schools. And I have received information that there has never been a case of discrimination in the court system of Ukraine. This is concerning, because on the one hand you have the situation of a problem that is real, affecting the real lives of people, and on the other hand you have lack of information that allows many people to negate that these real people exist. A particular sector of my interest is that of health. HIV is a real problem in Ukraine, but it's also a real problem when it intersects with issues of sexual orientation. This is what is called compounded stigma, because you add stigma coming out of two identities. Stigma associated with people who live with HIV, and stigma associated for being a sexual minority. And this has created some sort of consequences throughout the system. I'm very pleased to see that the Ukrainian state has taken some very positive measures in relation to HIV programming, and that there are also measures that have simplified in the last years, in the last 2 years particularly, the procedure for legal recognition of the gender identity of trans persons. More needs to be done. I am reported that still it is considered necessary in some cases to have sterilization to obtain legal gender recognition for trans persons, and that in some cases it is still required to actually have psychiatric internment. All of these measures connect with what we could call social inclusion. It is fundamental that the state adopt measures to ensure that nobody is left behind. The United Nations is working actively to promote the Sustainable Development Goals, And the main message of the Sustainable Development Goals is that in development, nobody will be left behind. So there is a need to ensure that we understand deeply how the real lives of LGBT people are affected in education, in labor, in health, in political participation, and in all aspects of life. It is fundamental to develop knowledge as to how, for example, LGBT people are affected by homelessness or by the inclusion in cultural life. This is going to be the crux of my recommendations to the state when it comes to social inclusion. And it all takes point of departure on the idea that information needs to be created, knowledge needs to be created. Again, I go back to this point. It is knowledge about the real everyday lives of real people that exist in Ukraine. A very important aspect of this is that people have the right not only to exist, but have the right to be seen to exist. So, the Ukrainian society may have seen over the last few years that NGOs and civil society organizations are determined to make events in the public space. They are determined to celebrate pride parades. They are determined to celebrate equality marches. When doing so, they are exercising a fundamental human right. One of the bases of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the right to freedom of assembly. Unfortunately, during the last few years, these events, these parades, these marches have also been under systematic attack from certain groups of society. I am deeply concerned about this, and I've expressed this concern to the state. I understand that these groups in society identify or are identified under denominations of ultra-conservative or ultra-right denominations. It is very concerning to me to hear that some of these events have not received adequate police protection. And I was pleasantly informed that in the recent times, there has been an effort to ensure that appropriate protection would actually be applied to these manifestations. I want to underscore that these parades, these events, these movements have an importance in themselves because they are an expression of a fundamental human right. But I also want to present you with my experience that this type of events also connect with other type of relationships that get formed throughout society. They nurture the idea that LGBT people are and should be active members of the community. They create useful working relationships between the LGBT community and police forces. They create useful relations between LGBT people and other forces of society, such as businesses and other actors. So I'm very concerned when I hear that this public space use, that the right to freedom of assembly is not respected. And as I say, I am happy to hear that in the last few years there has been an evolution, thanks not least to the response of the National Civil Police and its efforts to actually carry out protection in these events in a manner that is human rights compliant. On the other hand, I was speaking before about the fact that these cases apparently don't reach the courts of justice And I think that there is a significant worry on my part on the effect that none of the attacks that have been perpetrated on these marches, these events, have ever seen full investigation leading to convictions, meaning that there is a full mantle of impunity for the perpetrators of these attacks. And it is a recommendation that I have for the state of Ukraine to ensure the eradication of impunity in this case. Sexual orientation and gender identity lie at the base of very fundamental social discussions. And I can share with you my experience that this is an issue that people feel very passionately about. I think that debate on these issues should always be welcome in a democratic society. But there is a fundamental duty to have clear awareness of the type of debate that is protected and the type of debate and speech that incites to violence and hatred. That dividing line is the dividing line between protected speech and unprotected speech. And the fundamental line of recognizing is actually a duty of the state, and informing all forces in society where that line lies is the fundamental duty of the state. And enforcing sanctions when that line is crossed is the fundamental duty of the state. So one of the concerns that I have is that it appears to me that the debate on this matter in Ukraine doesn't actually fall under those checks. It is important that the line between protected speech and hate speech be recognized. I think that there's a particular obligation to ensure that public officers are aware of this line, and they are aware of the consequences of speech inciting to discrimination and hatred. A state that embraces universal human rights values needs to be represented by its elected officers also as representing human rights values. And I am concerned about the presence in the Ukrainian political debate about deep manifestations of hatred and discrimination by public officers and publicly appointed officers. I think in that case, the state as a figure has a responsibility to ensure that disciplinary sanctions are enforced. Within the space of democratic debate, it is important to engage all groups and forces in society. I have received indication that at the base of many of the campaigns to actually prevent adoption of legislation against discrimination or sanctioning hate, there are many social forces, including groups and also certain sectors of churches. These actors also need to abide by the rules of democratic debate and by the limits set between protected and non-protected speech, and by the awareness that hate speech is not to be promoted. But within those rules, it's very important to acknowledge the importance of debate of vigorous debate around these issues, because it is my firm conviction that a great majority of persons in Ukraine want to see everyone free from discrimination and violence. I mentioned to you that over the last 10 days I have been in different locations in the country. I was in Kiev, I was in Lviv, I was in Kharkiv. I've held dozens of meetings, and I've spoken to what I estimate are over 150 persons between state and non-state actors. I have found in all of them a great openness, great seriousness, and great respect. And so it is my sincere conviction that there is very good grounds to ensure the respect of everyone in Ukraine, that the work of eradicating violence and discrimination is a work that is possible and that it can be taken forward. And furthermore, I am convinced that there is the opportunity for the state to take further its role to promote measures to ensure that this violence and discrimination is eradicated. In that, I think that the state has already laid out an ambitious plan of action, which is the National Human Rights Action Plan. I think the measures in that plan are of extraordinary value when it comes to this work, and it is my sincere recommendation that they should be taken forward. I also think that a number of the measures concerning legal reform are well designed and are relevant and appropriate to actually deal with this issue. I know that there's a debate concerning the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and I think, again, that vigorous debate is positive. But I think that it's also important that we understand that these conventions are put in place to ensure that real women, real persons in homes all over Ukraine are protected from violence. So I think that it is important that a difference be drawn between abstract concepts such as gender and the reality that those concepts attempt to describe. I mentioned that I think that there's an extraordinary capital in Ukraine, in the openness of people, in the idea of respect, and that will be the tenor of my recommendations and my conclusions to the state. There is a possibility to take very specific measures to deal with this issue, and I am convinced that the program already laid out by the state, if carried out, will be a very significant step towards freedom and equality for every person in Ukraine, including every lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans person that lives in this country. Thank you very much.